Right, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Network 2020's discussion with Martin Wolf about the economy in an age of uncertainty. So I think anyone who has come across a chart that measures global uncertainty or global economic uncertainty knows that right now it is basically a classic hockey stick, and we're right on the tip of a steep upswing in uncertainty. So at Network 2020, we're working hard at holding conversations that help our audience make sense of this uncertain political and economic time. And for the economic piece, I can't think of anyone better to bring on board than Martin Wolf. I'm very eager to get to the conversation, and I will introduce Martin shortly, but just a few brief words about Network 2020. So we are a New York City-based nonprofit. We're over 20 years old, and we're really focused on bringing nuanced, incisive conversations about global affairs to rising and established leaders, both virtually as well as in person in New York. So if you're in person in New York, please join as a member. And I encourage everyone to follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, subscribe to YouTube channel to access our library of on-the-record discussions. It is also giving season, so I encourage anyone listening to donate to keep these vital discussions free and open to everyone around the world. So our guest today needs very little introduction. Mr. Martin Wolf, CBE, Chief Economics Commentator at the Financial Times, and widely regarded as one of the world's most astute and level-headed observers and chroniclers of economics around the world. He has written numerous books, including his most recent, the 2023, The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. So Martin, welcome back to Network 2020. I wish it could be in person as it has been before, but I'm so grateful that we have the technology that can bring you here virtually. There's a lot I'd like to get through, so I'll try to do about half an hour of conversation with you and then half an hour that we can open up to the audience. So why don't we dive in? Where I wanted to start is at the somewhat recent G20 summit, or I suppose it was the G19, given the absence of the US, where global debt distress, especially among countries in the global south, was a central concern. At the same time, very high public debt and rising servicing costs are becoming really major issues in both the US, I know for sure, and the UK. So, how would you characterize the global debt landscape right now? And what do you think we should understand about the different types of debt challenges that are facing advanced versus emerging economies? And what are some of the implications of just what's happening in the debt world, right?
Well, this really is a very complicated question, and there are some aspects that I'm following more closely than others. The debt in across the world is close to peak levels relative to world GDP. It's a bit variable. A peak was reached during the pandemic. Since then, there have been some declines, but they're not really significant, at least not in the big countries. The In general, the situation of public sectors is different from that of private sectors. There are different drivers going on. That depends, of course, on the country. And of course, the situation of countries that are easily able to borrow in their own currencies and have credible public debt managerial capacity is very, very different from the position of the countries you mentioned, particularly in the developing world, more than and here you can actually make a distinction increasingly between what we think of as classic developing countries together, really relatively poor countries, which, if they're going to borrow internationally, have to borrow in foreign currencies, and the emerging economies, which have been increasingly good at borrowing in their own currencies. They're not easily able, but they're much more easily able than they used to be to borrow in their own currencies internationally, because there are foreign demand for their currencies too, but they can borrow very, very comfortably in their domestic currencies if they want to. So China doesn't have, as an extreme example, any problems in borrowing. It has access to the largest pool of savings in the world, which is domestic, and it runs a huge current account surplus. So it's fine from a debt point of view, except for domestic debt problems. And domestic debt problems are always very different from international ones, because in the last resort, governments can rescue domestic debtors if they want to, and governments can, of course, access, if they're creditworthy, their own debt markets in their own currency. It makes a lot of difference. So I would say, with that pretty important background, there are clearly a lot, mostly of smaller developing countries, notably in Africa, which were very badly damaged by the pandemic. Their economies are weak. Uh, um, Unfortunately, extreme poverty is not continuing to decline as it was. And they have huge pressures from their young and relatively poor populations for spending, difficult to raise taxes. Aid is being cut very sharply by most countries, including, for example, my own. And they have become very dependent again on borrowing in foreign currencies. That always means relatively high interest rates because they're not seen as very creditworthy. And many of them now are facing very severe debt difficulties. It's a very complicated story, but it's very, very clear from recent work with the World Bank that this is a very big issue. Many of the emerging economies, the bigger ones anyway, are okay. I mean, take India, for example, it's not facing serious debt constraints. Now, of course, there are exceptions. Pakistan has had very big debt problems. It has to be rescued. The IMF is there. Of course, it's very dependent on China. Here we start getting into very specific countries with very specific problems. There are a lot of countries that borrowed from China that have had difficulties. Sri Lanka and Zambia are both noted cases. There are a lot of complexity there. I won't go further into that because we can use up the whole half hour. On the developed countries, well, the big story is no developed country, major or even small developed country, is close to a debt crisis now. They're all able to borrow at reasonable terms, but interest rates have risen a lot since the pandemic. We are no longer in anything close to zero rates. So the cost of borrowing is high. Many of the countries are running pretty large fiscal deficits, and the most important one that is doing so is the US. And that's very concerning because the dollar is so important and the dollar interest rates are so important. And I would say there's no crisis here, but there is a long-standing building debt problem. Because any plausible view of the future, and I wrote about that actually today, shows debt continue to rise. And that's partly because there's already so much debt and it's expensive. It's partly because of aging and the cost pressures of aging. It's partly because there's increasing pressure to spend on defense. It's partly because in many countries, growth is slower than it used to be. By the way, that is also true of the US, though it's not done as badly as other places. So I think of this not as a crisis in any sense, but as a long running ailment, which on any plausible view is going to get worse. And that suggests that at some point, we have to discuss it in detail, they're going to have problems dealing with it. There are also large parts of the private sector around the world which are highly indebted, and there are always connections between highly indebted private sectors and government sectors. But in general, outside China, which has had a huge build-up debt, private sector debt problems, this is a complicated, are somewhat better than immediately before the global financial crisis of 2007 to 9. It's a very quick summary of this unbelievably complicated situation.
Well done on that, and thank you. And so it's nice to know that at least in the US, this is more of a chronic condition that needs to be managed properly than, an acute
Chronic
crisis.
conditions can become critical unexpectedly, and there I wrote today about possible ways in which it could go critical. You never know quite how these accumulations of debt and the very complicated structure of modern debt markets, which are quite different from the way they used to be, will interact. And you could suddenly find that there's a loss of confidence in the US dollar, a collapse in the currency is possible. I'm not predicting it. Then the Fed would have to raise rates, or if not, inflation starts shooting up. Either way, that could be very destabilizing, but I'm not forecasting it within a reasonable period. It's just a risk out there. And at the moment, I think a manageable one, but whoever the next chair of the Fed is might have an exciting life.
Mhm. Well, let's see. And for those listening, we actually had held a conversation last week on the role of the dollar. So hopefully Brian can put that in the chat for anyone who's interested. Just shifting gears a little bit, if I understand correctly, you started studying economics as a means of understanding politics. So I'd like to switch a little bit to the crisis of democratic capitalism, where you argue that our political dysfunction is deeply rooted in economic forces. So looking at the US and the UK today, both very polarized societies, a lot of polarized politics, discontent, populism. How much of the current political moment do you see as fundamentally being economic? And are these similar forces driving political shifts either to the right or to the left in other parts of the world?
I think this is a fascinating question, much more complicated than the one we've discussed, and that was bad enough. I think let me separate out, sort of talk a little bit about where I am now in terms of where I've been. I'm a child of refugees who came from continental Europe before the Second World War. They were Jewish, they were Jews, and they fled for their lives, basically. And they survived, their immediate family survived, but their wider families were all killed. Now, that inevitably, growing up as a child with foreign parents were refugees, no other family in the country, you were aware of this. And I was very well aware of what had happened in Europe. And I came to the view in my adolescence, really, that obviously part of what triggered Nazism and the breakdown was the Great Depression. And that's become more and more obvious to me. So that is part of the reason I wanted to study economics. More broadly, I wanted to understand the obviously gigantic role economics plays in politics, because our societies, and I have not changed my view at all, have to a very considerable extent been built on the proposition over the last 2 centuries, but particularly the last century or so, on the proposition that people are going to get better off all the time. And that's completely revolutionary in the sense that before about 1800, no one had thought that was a possibility. It's just not what happened. Basically, economic conditions at the end of people's lives were much like what they were at the beginning of people's lives. So on a generational basis, it didn't matter. But we offer people the opportunity and the hope of being well off, getting better off, and avoiding huge crises. And I think that became a core part of our political promise. And if you look at the political debates in America or Britain, really over the last, going back throughout the 19th century, but certainly by the late 19th century through the 20th and 21st century so far, much of the politics has been about economics in all sorts of different ways, but of course it has. And because that's about how people live. And so one reason I think for the disenchantment with our politics, and that's a core part of my book, was longer term economic failures, rising inequality, deindustrialization, profound shifts in relative economic position of men versus women, all sorts of things which shook a lot of people's trust in the quote unquote economic justice of the system. And then along came this gigantic financial crisis. And my view is, and it remains, that basically made people believe that the people in charge were corrupt and incompetent. And that led them to think we should get somebody completely new who could deliver us from this problem. Now, of course, when people like the populist leaders that then tend to emerge, they have to have a narrative. And we know very well, because this was very much what happened in the 30s, as again I point out, that people look at, they sort of look to blame people whom people can easily identify as responsible for what this happened. For it's because, to put it bluntly, a lot of the people who actually do have genuine power and might even be responsible for a lot of this want to divert the blame. And that's pretty obvious. And so this tends to generate two phenomena which are linked. A politics of us against them. And the politics of us and them shifts the blame in large part from large parts of the elite to outsiders, and the whole slew of outsiders, foreigners, obviously, minorities, people who think differently, have strange ideas, and all the rest of it. That tends to be part of the politics when the sense of confidence in democracy as us goes. And I think what we are seeing is an interaction between economic frustration and anger and that sort of politics. And that sort of politics, as we know, does pretty well. And the more ignorant, and there are systems for keeping people ignorant, people are about what's going on underneath, the more likely that form of politics is to emerge, and it tends to be anti-democratic. So my view, it is a bit lengthy, is that the economics and the politics tend to interact in complex, unpredictable, and from the point of view of somebody like me, rather irrational ways, but that doesn't matter. Obviously, in retrospect, the promises that Adolf Hitler, and I'm not comparing him directly with anyone now, made for improving the position of the German people were complete nonsense, but a lot of people bought it. And they bought it by his emphasizing, in response to his emphasizing the we, the us, against the enemies within. Well, I think it's not very difficult to see parallels between that sort of politics then and what we're seeing in much of the world, including my own country and certainly in the US today.
And do you see anything emerging from this? I mean, I know there's a lot of talk, at least in the geopolitical side of things, about, the end of the, post-World War II liberal world order. On the economic front, are we returning or to some pre-World War II stage, or are we entering something totally new that has a mix of, all different systems that came before? Is there any sort of emerging order that you see happening?
I think that's an immensely important question. I think that at the moment we're at the time of revolutionary upheaval, or rather, um, famous quote: the old order is dead and the new is struggling to be born. So I don't think we see the new. Uh, Now, when I say the old order is dead, that can be seen in many different ways. But there are at least two or three. There are two or three obvious ways. The old institutions of the multilateral economic system, predominantly the systems created by the US with its allies after the war, which at first were really the systems of the West. Then quite a few developing and emerging countries got attached to it. And then with the fall of the Soviet Union, they became global. They were seen as global. And that system is clearly breaking down. And it's breaking down mostly because the US is not interested in it anymore. And that's particularly true in the trade area. It's also in development cooperation, though this is a much more recent one. Multilateral approaches to climate have also gone. The sort of idea that the way to manage the world is through international organizations which operate through consensus. They operate multilaterally, which was, I think, part of the US promise. It was never fully realized. That's gone because the US doesn't believe in it. And I think it was already somewhat clear with the first Trump administration and with the Biden administration, but under the current administration, it's completely obvious. They are absolutely no interest in any of the concepts underlying this system. This is, of course, reinforced by the second big change that for the first time in US history since, let's say, the late 19th century, there is a peer rival in the world, a superpower in some ways bigger than America, obviously with enormous resources and potential, technologically increasingly powerful, which operates in the world system, but also is obviously not fully committed to any sort of liberal order in all truth. So in this system, this power system, we have a breakdown in international relations. This is occurring partly as a result of that, alongside a period of a large amount of international disorder in both the economic and political sphere, including wars, of course, again, not unheard of. But I think this amounts to a comprehensive breakdown of the order that was established up to the Second World War. But I think there's something deeper going on, and it is worth stressing that. At least my view is that you can see it in the US, but you can also see it in other Western countries. There is actually a reaction against even deeper parts of modern Western culture. And by that, I mean a reaction against the Enlightenment and Enlightenment principles, a reaction against the idea of the rule of law, as opposed to, let's bluntly, monarchical ways of governing, a reaction against many of the ideas, egalitarian ideas that we've lived with and believed in the last 100 years. I mean, genuine reactionary movements which embrace nationalist, xenophobic, ideas of the sort we've seen before the war. And they are now in core countries of the liberal revolution, of the American Constitution, I think in certain important ways is at stake. So I think what's going on now includes very definitely this breakdown of the post-war order, but because of the disappointment of people with what's happening, this is culminating in, or showing signs of being, an anti-democratic revolution. And the democratic idea, the liberal and democratic ideas, which we came to some sort of fruition in the last century or so, of course, had their roots already in the beginning, in the 17th century. So this is a very big process. Where this will end up, I have no idea. But if I may put it this way, it frightens the hell out of me.
Well said. Thank you. You brought up China. You've recently said in a conversation that you're long on China, albeit sadly because of its technological dynamism, because you see, as you just referenced, the Western alliance system weakening. So at a time when narratives about China, they seem to range from decline and stagnation to resurgent superpower. What informs your read of China's actual trajectory, economically, technologically, et cetera? And what do you think we tend to, and by we, I mean the US, the UK, most misunderstand about where China is heading?
Well, I would have to emphasize that I always say this. It will be crazy for me to claim expertise on China. All I can say is I've been there more or less every year and talked to people since 1993. I've read a lot, but I don't read Mandarin, so I ought to speak it. I have many Chinese friends whom I regard as wonderful and brilliant. And of course, I thought it's the most important story of my lifetime. As an economist, as somebody interested in development, somebody interested in politics, this is the most remarkable story of my lifetime. So, but I emphasize my ignorance. I think the ignorance is widely shared. Now, the second, including by not by all, but many people who think they're experts. The second point is one has to make some judgments. So in the late 70s, it was very easy to conclude that China was never going to be important. You know, if you looked at China in 1978 or 1980, yes, it's a big country, but it's incredibly poor and backward. It's not going to go anywhere. That would have been a very, very serious mistake. So my starting point for thinking about China is not to think about what policies they're following now. We can come to that in a second. What's going on now, though that's very important, but to consider the potential and ambitions of the place. And the thing to remember is it is a declining population slowly, but it's 1.4 billion people. They are fantastically capable and committed to learning and what they've achieved already in the last 40 years, if you think, is simply unbelievable. It's stupendous. They have moved to the forefront of technology, developed an incredibly sophisticated economy from nothing, really. So you can't underestimate them. They have some very deep problems. Many of the problems are created by the way the political system works, which is important, particularly now. It's become more centralized, more control oriented than before, which I think is an economic problem, though I understand why it's happened. And they have some really very significant imbalances in this economy, which are partly a function of that political system. At the moment, as a result of making some very big mistakes, I think, which I've written about for the last 20 years, I started writing about this long before Xi Jinping became the leader. They have made some big mistakes, and as a result, growth has slowed more than it should have done, but they're still innovating like mad. So we look at the head. You rightly say it. Some people would say, if you look at the trajectory of the Chinese economy over the last 15 years, the growth has slowed very, very sharply. They're probably overestimating or over-reporting it now. The growth might really be 3 or 4% now. That's a very questionable, but some people would say lower. I am not convinced of that at all. And therefore, they basically sort of lost it, and they'll never pass America. I don't believe this, but I don't believe this because of any analysis of the economy. I believe their economic problems are fixable if the political system, I've written about this many times, is sufficiently adaptable. And my bet is that if the Chinese actually work out that they are no longer growing at 4 or 5%, say, which would be roughly twice America. I mean, so still getting bigger. My guess is that one way or another, the system will adapt and change to ensure they can. And I have no doubt they have the potential, none, to grow faster than that, as fast as that. And I think actually faster. If you look at the human resources, the incredible savings and investment rate, how well they're doing in international competition, the way the US is destroying its own alliances. I mean, from their point of view, the objective situation is one in which they can grow faster because, crucially, while they're a big, huge economy, in real GDP per head terms, they're only a third of US levels. They don't have to get above half. And the economy is much bigger than America's. So my view is if you look at the potential, look at what they've achieved, recognize the genuine problems and the mistakes they've made, his question ultimately is the bet you make that the Chinese will not solve those problems and will go downhill and become like Russia under Brezhnev, or is your bet that the Chinese will solve these problems and come back? And I think the shrewd bet, and I suspect the sensible bet anyway, because we don't know, is that they actually will solve these problems and they're going to continue to rise. And I think it's dangerously complacent for Western powers to believe otherwise. And let me add this, it is therefore very foolish of the US in particular, which has a quarter of China's population, to assume that in this competition with China, it needs no allies. I think this is a very profound mistake, and that's the mistake I think that America has now made. And so I am, for all these reasons, I've now spelled it out in detail, bullish on China.
Thank you. I'd like to, this is actually perfectly precise on timing, open it up to audience questions. So if you're in the audience and you would like to ask a question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A box, and I will try to get to as many as I can. So we have one here, and the questioner asks, very great direct question, how can Europe grow again?
Well, I have nothing hugely new to say about this, though. Of course, I've written a lot about it. Well, it isn't right to say Europe isn't growing. It's just growing slowly. Now, one of the reasons it's growing slowly is that European economies are aging, really aging. Birth rates are extremely low, well below replacement in pretty well every country. And labor forces are not growing, and Europeans have become increasingly unhappy, well, which is also, of course, happening in the US, about immigration. But our fertility, our demographic position is worse. So that makes it very difficult for the economies to grow. Uh, Productivity growth is also slow. And I think if we look at it, and this is actually interestingly quite recent, by recent, since about 2010. That's not yesterday, but for me, that's recent. I tend to think of economic progress processes in longer term. Um, so what are the explanations for Europe's slowing productivity growth? By the way, there are a lot of estimates of the decline of the economy, which are really about exchange rate movements. And I tend to not to spend a lot of time worrying about exchange rates because they're very influenced by short-run market expectations. Are people pouring money into the US stock market, for example? So I don't worry about that so much. But there's no doubt productivity growth in the US has been significantly, at least a percentage point a year higher than the Europe for at least the last 15 years. What's going on there? I think there are essentially linked things. Europe, it seems very important in this sector. In the most important dynamic sector, the tech sector, which is driving the US, of course, very significantly, as where much of the productivity growth, and driving China now increasingly. Europe doesn't have really large players at all. There's nothing much. And the big problem there is Europe is still a fragmented market. And it's not just a fragmented market for the products, it's a fragmented market for labor. And it's a highly regulated, fragmented market for labor. And it's a really, really highly fragmented market for capital. And that means that basically, no, the European economy is big enough, but it's fragmented. This is Mario Draghi's argument, and on all these fronts. And the countries are all too small. I put it very, I mean, roughly speaking, it's like, but California's economy is roughly speaking as big as that of the larger European countries. And California is California, well, at least Silicon Valley is Silicon Valley. There are different problems in California I know about, because Silicon Valley is a hub, a major hub, not the only one, for the US market, and from that, the world. And the fragmentation of the European market is an absolutely fundamental reality because ultimately Europe is not a thing. It's many countries together which don't cooperate very, very well. And that's completely obvious. It's also very highly regulated. And in certain areas, the labor market and the capital markets are decisive. Labor market is mostly domestic regulation. Capital markets operates domestically, but affects the whole integration of the capital market. There just aren't the markets that allow the sort of experimentation that these new sectors seem to demand. And of course, because every decision that matters really has to be agreed by the member states, at least by the bigger ones, all change is very slow. And finally, I suppose it is true that culturally, for many reasons, Europe has become, with a little c, conservative. Not conservative in the way the Americans think about conservatism, which I think is being reactionary. I think increasingly today, but they just don't want much change. The aging society shows itself. I wrote about this a long time ago, in being dominated by the desire of older people for nothing very terrible to happen. But this goes through, I think, the culture of the continent, and the UK is part of this. So those are the reasons I would put forward, and I think it might have to get quite a bit worse before it gets better. I think there has to be real fear. Now, I think that actually the combination of the huge shift in American policy towards Europe, which is very deeply felt, and the colossal deterioration of Europe's position in industry and manufacturing, where Europe was really very strong even 10 years ago. The deterioration relative to China. I mean, what's happening to the competitiveness of the European automobile industry, a hugely important industry for Europe because of the transformation of China, China's role in clean energy, all the things the US has abandoned. But for Europe, these really matter. So in many ways, though the US shock, the geopolitical US shock is a very big deal, the geoeconomic China shock for Europe is even bigger. And it will be interesting to see how that interaction plays out.
Thank you. Someone writes in, what do you see as the realistic economic impact of AI in the near and distant future? Do you expect AI to significantly transform growth, inequality, or global competition, or all of the above? Thank you.
I think the only thing I can say about AI with confidence, which is I know enough to know that I don't know, as it were. So I read with interest people who feel absolutely confident that they know what's going to happen. And I'm pretty clear that I don't know. But this is my heroic and probably embarrassing guess or guesses, with the absolute, insistence that I have in this area. I know nothing really beyond what I know about how past technological revolutions have tended to work through the system, with some things about this specific revolution. I mean, first of all, my guess is the long-term impact of AI, which might be decades or might be quicker, will be very, very large. And as with most new technologies, the really important changes caused by this will be, as it were, social and human more than narrowly economic. I mean, when, for example, obvious example, the internet, which is the most recent big change, there was a lot of talk about the liberation it would give, how it would end the oppression by the state, all sorts of complete nonsense, as it turned out. I was always very skeptical. But nobody that I can remember, I may well be wrong, talked about the human effects, the effects of the then non-existent social media industry on young people and children, on how people would be educated, on how people would stop reading or not reading, those sorts of huge, how politics would work. If you look back on the internet, yes, of course, the economic changes are very important, that they've changed the way we live. But to me, it's pretty clear that the really big changes are social and economic. Similarly, the motor vehicle industry, of course, was absolutely transformative. But the real transformation involved is it accelerated not just urbanization, but a certain sort of urbanization. So I think you have to understand the social and cultural impact of a huge technology. And I think what is likely to turn out to be a situation in which we increasingly delegate a very large part of our intellectual processes to machines. We just cannot, I think, exaggerate how big that is likely to be. because the people created in that environment, the children of today, will just be really different. Certainly from me, but even from young people. So this, don't underestimate. What will it do to politics and so forth? All this is really, really, really big. Will we be able to control and manage any of this? No, of course we won't. We never do. We can't. So I think there's a lot of what we don't know is because of how that will play out. If we look at the economic effects, it seems to me that pretty clear from the relevant analysis that there are a very large number of information processing activities, broadly defined, which means information processing jobs. The junior people in IT firms, in law firms, doing journalism, all the rest of it are really threatened by this, and maybe increasingly the senior people. But the really important thing, it's the first technological revolution that the internet had some of this, which is skill, not just skill replacing. It is skill augmenting in some ways, but in some important ways, skill replacing. And the skills that are being replaced are that of relatively educated people. That's completely different from the deindustrialization processes that we saw so active in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. So we haven't had a social revolution that directly affected us, as it were. You, me, and well, not me, I'm too old, but the people listening. And I think the social consequences of that could be quite extraordinary. And it seems to me that looks like being quite a revolutionary process. A lot of activities that we have taken for granted as the ladder for educated young people looks to me like being constrained. And the revolutionary consequences of that, I think, cannot be underestimated. I think it is likely to accelerate measured growth somewhat. But I don't think it will do more than bring us back to the sort of growth rate we were used to 20, 30 years ago. I might be wrong. I have friends who think that it will revolutionize productivity, and that might be true. And that gets you to the next big thing, which is who is going to get the gains? As things are at the moment, it looks plausible, though it's very far from certain, that it will make the inequality associated with the new big tech world worse. It looks plausible. And now, that definite no, will they maintain their ownership of these activities once they become commodities? Where will the really big profits be made? It doesn't look as though it's going to be in creating AI. So who will really make the big profits? We don't know. But I wouldn't be surprised if the inequality got worse. And finally, on the short run issue, I don't think at the moment that I see a really productive and profitable business model in the AI sector. And so I suspect there is a bubble in the prices of the AI, which doesn't matter because that's very common. That happened with almost every previous major technological revolution. There was over-optimism about the profits. And we don't know yet who will make the money out of it and where the really big changes created by it will occur. Because I think it's probably too early to be sure of that. So this is high uncertainty, lots of anxiety, and I'm pretty sure this is not a world I particularly want to live in. So, which is quite good because I won't be living in it.
Well, I'd like to just pick up on a couple of threads of things that you've mentioned, both this, the question of growth, but more importantly, this underlying trend of demographics and the importance of demographics, whether they're growing or shrinking, along with this technology. We are at a time aggregate in the world where we have an aging, shrinking population for the first time. I mean, do we need a rethink about what we're trying to achieve as a society in terms of, growth, how we use technology, how we care for people? I mean, what's your take on that? Is this a time for a rethink?
I just read this morning a piece by, I think it's Ross Douthat, I hope I've got the name, in the New York Times, who's very, very agitated, as quite a few people on the right seem to be, about the fall in the birth rate and the disappearance of humanity, and none of which I really regard as an important problem. There's a sort of hysteria, I think, out there about the possibility that populations will decline. Um, I do like to point out that over the last 200 years, roughly, the population of the world has increased sixfold. And, the population of humans live very badly, it said, but not for this reason, perfectly well when there were 1.2 billion. And not so long ago, i.e., when I started doing my work as an economist, the main hysteria was about the unbelievably high birth rates and high fertility rates, and the world will be swamped by foreigners. Subtext, they're mostly going to be colored. Yes, it was that racist. And now suddenly there's this hysteria about the reverse direction. I think this is hugely overcooked. Now, I agree. If you've got a fertility rate of 0.8 of a child on average, so each generation is less than half the previous one, you do have a problem. And there's no doubt there are some societies in that situation. And how they're going to solve this, what mixture of technology, longer working lives, and immigration, I don't know. But that's not the general situation. First of all, second, the big collapse in fertility rates has actually been relatively recent, and I wouldn't be surprised if it changed again, if with relatively limited changes in policy. For example, in most of our societies, amazingly, including the US, we've made it very, very difficult for young people to get hold of nice houses. Well, if we do that, then not surprising they won't have children. Well, that's a pretty simple problem to solve, certainly with the land resources of America or Canada or Australia, where these problems exist. So I'm not convinced that if people really want, as they say they are, want on the whole to have two children or something like that, that's not going to be a problem, of course. And we can certainly make changes in our societies, the social arrangements to fix that. And over time, I suspect we will do. A lot of the subtext of this, in my view, I'll make two other points, is, let's be very brutal about it since I'm talking to you, it's misogynist. Basically, what they want is, and that's something I really, really object to passionately, because I'm married to a highly successful professional woman. My daughter is similarly, and I'm not going to have them live the lives of my grandmother. I can remember it. Now, it wasn't terrible, by the way, but it was very limited. So they really want women to go back into the kitchen. And it's very clear that the part of this right-wing reactionary movement we're seeing is misogynist in the worst possible way. And I think my view is that's just not on. And it's not necessary, because in the end, we have to create social arrangements, society in which women are happy to combine working lives with having children, and it's clearly the decision that they in particular make. But of course, men are involved. Young people need to feel confident enough in the future to be willing to do this, and that's our job. And we have obviously not done it very badly. Well, then we should rethink. The final point is, I've written quite a bit on this. That's the fertility side. I think people underestimate the ability of people to continue to work. The Japanese have done a very good job of getting people to work longer. Of course, people can't do the hugely onerous, physically backbreaking jobs that used to be the jobs of many men, for example. They couldn't do that in their 60s. But most people don't do those jobs anymore. That's not what a working life now includes. And if I may say so, though I probably shouldn't, well, I'm nearly 80. So it seems to me evident that people can go on with the right circumstances if society says, well, retirement at 65 was normal once, but why shouldn't it be retirement at 80? Of course, everybody can't do it, but we can do everything we can to deal with it. So all I'm saying is, yes, it's a challenge. But I'm convinced that with appropriate policy adjustments, we can adjust to a world of falling populations not collapsing. I recognize that's a problem, particularly we don't want any immigrants, but falling populations. And by the way, we will have to accept immigrants. So what? I mean, almost everybody in America was an immigrant. In fact, just about everybody or a descendant of immigrants. What's the problem? I think this hysteria really annoys me. But there are problems here and challenges, and they have to be fixed. And I think it's not particularly difficult to see what you need to do. Of course, you'd have to pay more taxes to support people with children. So tough.
Um, I'm hoping to get in another couple of questions here. So we have one here. Let's see. We have a couple on tariffs. If you wouldn't mind providing your view on tariffs as a political tool versus an economic tool. Do you see them offering any benefit or just causing more economic harm?
Well, I think that I've spent most of my professional life thinking about trade and international economics, so this is very much my home territory. And my first major book was in praise of globalization, so I'm the enemy. And I still hold the view that the era of globalization brought about larger expansion of economic opportunity and prosperity to the world than any other period in world history. And I'm not in the least ashamed. I can give you all the figures, but why should I? Dramatic decline in extreme poverty across the world, and that was not an accident. The I think there are two cases. The legitimate cases for policy are that people are hurt by large changes in competitiveness, and which includes trade, but not only trade, by the way. Um, and most people weren't, many people adversely affected by trade were not helped. They weren't helped to get new jobs. The income wasn't supported. They were basically left to fester and rot almost everywhere. And if I may say so, particularly in America. That's the third point. And second, of course, there are issues of economic and political and security, broadly defined, which are a perfectly legitimate case, and economic progress for intervening to ensure that you continue to have not only strong positions in current technologies, but also future technologies as the basis for national security and prosperity. I'm not laissez-faire. This is very different from being fairly liberal on trade. And America developed in part because of industrial policies, of which the tariff was one element. There were other elements, very important elements, land grants and things like that for railways and so forth. But so I'm not again saying there shouldn't be no trade policy, but my own view is that if you look at the problems of the developed world, imports really weren't the decisive factor in creating the many ailments we see. There were many other things going on, financialization, changes in labor markets and so forth. When we're focusing on imports, because it's diversion, we can blame foreigners. It's very easy to blame foreigners. And I don't think they've been the root of the problem. They certainly weren't responsible for the global financial crisis, not trade policy. So but on the really heart of the question, do I think the tariff policy as followed currently by the American administration makes any economic sense, in the sense that it's targeted at developing the industries that are the most important for the future of America, that they are sufficiently stable and well thought out to be good signals of where American resources should now be invested, that they are likely to generate efficient new industries, given the random structure of those tariffs, in terms of tariffs on inputs against tariffs on final consumer goods. It's a complete mess. Nobody in the history of the world, and I know about trade policy for quite a long time, has ever thought this was a sensible way to run tariffs. There's no thought going into their structure. They've been changing all the time. They are random across products and across countries. And they've just created a large amount of uncertainty. Less uncertainty now than a few months ago, but when you were talking about certainty, this is part of it. And this is part of one of what is to me the most fascinating and sobering and scary aspect about economic policy making in the current context in America is that none of it, from my point of view, just makes any sense. I can't see any logic. If I were a protectionist of the type that America had in the late 19th century, I will be shaking my head. What is this about? What is the sort of economy that the US expects to end up with? One of the problems with tariffs is you protect your home market, but it's always a tax on exports. I can't explain why tariffs are a tax on export, they are. But the world market is much bigger than your home market. So let's take one obvious case. China has a vastly bigger market for automobiles than America has. So protecting the domestic market for America is not going to create a competitive international automobile industry. There are other reasons why it won't, because of resistance to clean tech. But none of this makes sense as a policy designed to make America prosperous. It's designed to make America look powerful because it can bully people. That's not the same thing. It's something quite different. So no, I can't see any sense in this.
Thank you. And my final question, which I feel like is a good one to end on, but might be a big question. So the questioner writes, we see significant price bubbles in most asset classes, driven in part by significant polarization of wealth, as this wealth needs to find a home, usually in financial assets. Social tension is unsurprisingly rising. Should we try to avoid the revolutionary change which often follows? And if so, how?
Well, I think that's a reasonable description, though I would have to say that there have been lots of bubbles in the past. They usually cause inequality. Whether they're caused by inequality is a more complicated question. But obviously, if you have very rapidly rising asset prices, particularly equities, well, in every country, equities are always owned, predominantly owned by a relatively small portion of the population. Of course, they get richer. I mean, that is inevitable. Now, it looks to me at the moment that what's going to follow this period is a counter-revolution, not a revolution. It's, of course, equally revolutionary, but it's essentially the promise, this is historically very common with reactionary political movements, is, I quote, to make America great again. The again is, I think, the most important word there. It's nostalgic. And very often in deeply troubled time, not always at all, but that's another question, what sometimes one and sometimes the other. But often in deeply troubled times, the desire of the people who feel they're doing badly, often people who have been in the middle and feel they're sliding to the bottom. That's a core part of my book. This fear of downward mobility is nostalgia, to go back to what they thought it was like when they were children. Often there's other elements here, the nostalgia of young men for a world they never saw. That's another subject. But a part of it is the desire to go back. Now, that can be quite revolutionary. There's no doubt reactionary movements with that sort of focus are revolutionary in the sense they undo much of what has happened more recently. And we in Europe, because of what happened in the 20s and 30s, are very, very well aware of that story. But interestingly, if I look at the politics of America, of Europe, that's what I see. The left looks sort of left revolutionary, egalitarian revolution, and seem to be essentially a parlor game for scholars and academics. They're not majority movements. Yes, they seem to be more provocative, but if I look at the new mayor of New York, he's not a revolutionary. I mean, really, what he's promising by the standards of real revolutions, and is no more than mildly updated social democracy. So what is striking to me, if you compare it with the the first part of the 20th century, when there were communists everywhere, I mean, real communists, they aren't there anymore. So it's a reactionary stage. Is there anything we can do to stop that? Well, I'd hoped that we could do that by having more successful modernizing policy of the type we've discussed in the case of, for instance, dealing with demography. I seem to have been unsuccessful in that. Maybe it's too complicated or I'm too arrogant, but that was the theme of my book, that we had to make today better. We can't go back to yesterday, that's obvious. And the world of some completely imaginary future that has never existed. We tried that in the 20th century with the communist movements and they failed. Try to make today better. But apparently that doesn't sell well. And that is, to me, very, very depressing. But I don't want revolution. I don't think it'll come from the left. I think we're getting reactionary revolutions from the right, and that will be hell.
Well, on that positive note, thank you for joining us again, Martin. It's just such a privilege to talk to you. I really appreciate it. Thank you everyone for joining. Again, we're doing a few events. We have one next week on critical minerals in Africa, and that's free and open to all. We also have one for those in New York on China. We encourage everyone to join as a member, gift a membership, donate to us. This helps us to continue to do this work. And Martin, it's just such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
It was wonderful. You asked such wonderful questions.
It also makes a great Christmas book, or holiday book. So there you go. All right. Thank you.
Good night.